Today, I'm happy to present the second half of my interview with archaeologist and author Richard Carrico. In the first half, we spoke about the history, especially the early history of the Presidio in San Diego, which is fairly unknown to most people who might live there and visit there often. In this second half, we get a little bit into things such as food, daily life, the history of Old Town, which is the old central historical core of the city of San Diego that kind of grew up at the bottom of the hill below the Presidio. And we even get into issues of crime and punishment and the darker parts of the history of the Presidio. I think you're going to really enjoy it, and hopefully it will encourage you to get and read Richard's book. So let's listen to the second and final half of my interview with author Richard Carrico. You spent a lot of time in this book talking about the excavations, the archaeological studies done on the Presidio and its surroundings. Is there anything in particular that, especially from your experience, that stood out as a really interesting find or moment during your excavations, for example?
Yeah, there's a couple. I guess the most surprising one, and it started from day one. So originally, Dr. Brandis from USD ran the excavation because Paul Ezel went on a sabbatical. So Paul Ezel from San Diego State College at the time, in concert with this historical society, which is now the History Center, agreed to do this dig. And then Paul got a sabbatical to go to Brazil for a year. So of course he went, right? So Brandis took over the excavation for a year, and then Paul came back and took it over. And Paul was told, and I talked to some of these people later, we're talking 1968, Paul was told that where the cross is on top of the hill is where the church is. And this is like complete circular reasoning as it turned out. The cross was put there because people thought that's where the church was. And then in common folklore, it became that's where the church is because that's where the cross is, right? Because Paul wanted nothing to do with the church. He wanted nothing to do with a cemetery in particular, because he knew, it can take 200 hours to excavate a skeleton correctly. That's a whole semester for one person. He didn't want to deal with the politics of it. So he was told down there, down the hill, is where the commandant's house and some of the barracks were. So that's where he dug. And his surprise, and then later my surprise based on his surprise, was he kept finding in the floor of the church, he realized it was a church after a while because he kept finding rosary bead pieces and found the altar and the little thing that's in the ground next to the altar where you pour the unused wine from communion. In the Southwest, it's called a sapau, and I don't remember what the Spanish name is. It's in my book. Anyway, so he's pretty sure now he's got a church, and he sees these slumps in the floor where the tiles.
And this is at the bottom of the hill, correct?
Yeah, off to one side of it. It's on the relatively flat area because they terraced it. They actually terraced it. And so he pops some of the floor tiles out and finds burials. So he ended up finding all manner of burials under the floor of the church and under the altar and in the side chapel. And that he didn't like that, but so later when he expanded the excavation, and by the time I had come on, he had gone outside the wall of the church and found the Campo Santo. So in total, we, even though I wasn't there all the time, but we, San Diego State, excavated 120 remains, 120. The death records, because I've gone through them extensively, and now with the Huntington, you can click on the Huntington and the People's Project, they list 220 people buried out there. So we found 120 of the 220. I believe some are still outside the wall. Some were infants, and we're probably not going to find any remains from them. So that was So for me, studying the burial record, and a colleague of mine wrote his master's thesis on basically a physical anthropological study of about 100 of the burials. What surprised me about it was, again, the number of children. That just never dawned on me, the number of children. And then in general, the health. They were actually pretty healthy, probably more so than the people at the mission for all kinds of reasons. But that was one part of it. Another part was you could see over the years how they kept adding on to the mission. Somebody built a side chapel, probably the blacksmith Romero for his family, which is pretty common in Catholic world to build side chapel, like Notre Dame has 10 of them or something, right?
Sure.
So we found this, that where they actually cut into the adobe wall to bring the new adobe wall into it. So architecturally, that was really interesting. And then the whole thing about, digging all the trenches to put the boulders in, to put the adobe wall on top of the boulder. And I'm just thinking, soldiers didn't do this. This is all Native American workers building all this. So the architecture was pretty surprising. And then I guess not exactly archaeological, but based on the archival record, being able to rebuild or restore who the people were there. So in the book, I talk about Sinew Scene, who was a Kumeyaay 14-year-old who married a soldier, moved to Presidio Hill from South Bay, had 4 or 5 children with him. He died. Somebody said killed by natives, but he died. And then she married a mulatto, what was at the time called a mulatto, a Cubano, a half-black, Afro-Caribbean. This is probably a better phrase, right? And had 3 or 4 children with him. So right there, that's just a beautiful snapshot of that diversity. So when you think about the Presidio and the languages you would have heard if you walked around there on a given day, the food that might have been cooking, the skin tone of the people, the experiences that they had. This particular soldier was stationed in Cuba before he came over here, right? So all of that was kind of surprising to me. The cemetery, the Camposanto, the architecture, and just especially as we try to celebrate diversity. Diversity is nothing new. Our acknowledgement of it might be, but it's nothing new. Yeah.
You mentioned food a couple of times, and you have a chapter dedicated to food, cuisine, Presidial cuisine. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. A colleague of mine, Steve Van Warmer, and his wife and Sue Wade, another archaeologist, last year came out with a 5-volume set on the ceramics of the Presidio. And in this case, it's largely the chapel complex. And they spent 7 years looking at every ceramic sherd from that excavation. And I lost track of the number at one point, but it was more than 16,000, just European, English, European, and obviously Maiolica, and T-zone brownware, the local ware of the Kumeyaay people, and wrote this amazing, it's on academia.edu.
Oh, so it's available. Great.
Yeah. He wanted to get it published, but he got kind of sideways with San Diego State. Plus, it was huge. I mean, it literally is 5 volumes, amazing photographs and amazing images. Most of the images of ceramics in my book came from his work with his acknowledgement. But he had a really good chapter in talking about ceramic use where he talks about the foods. And he's bilingual. Most of his family actually lives in Baja California. They run fishing camps, and they have for 60 years, I think. So I borrowed some of his material, with acknowledgments, and then my own experience in Baja California and in Mexico. So, for instance, we found lots of comals, which are in this case flat slabs that you would cook on. And oftentimes that's for doing your tortillas. So you've made your maza and you got your flour tortilla, and today we'd put it in a skillet or cast iron, whatever. They would throw it on this rock with a fire underneath it and toast them that way, both corn and they're not frying stuff like Tex-Mex does today, right? This is more authentic. So lots of examples of grinding tools that would be used to process both flour from wheat, but also from corn, the native plant, maize, right? So lots of flour and corn tortillas, um, descriptions in different articles and books about frijoles, different ways to soak the beans and then cook them in big pots. And not unlike porridge in the English cuisine, these pots of beans might be sitting somewhere keeping semi-warm for day after day after day after day because it's a staple, and you keep adding new things to it. We know they used pork. The Natural History Museum down here did analysis on the bones, the animal bones, and I think Paul Chase wrote an article called "The First Chicken Burrito in California," something like that. Anyway, so probably a fair amount of chicken, pork, some cattle, and if you know Spanish or Mexican cuisine, a lot of the bones certainly wouldn't have been sawed. They were cut with a cleaver. So we found evidence of that. They didn't do a lot of sawing of the bone, and
Hmm.
they're usually relatively small because they're going to go into a caldo, into a pot, to make a soup and get the marrow extracted from it. So it looks like a lot of soups. Um, we don't know about rice. It's not mentioned much. It would have had to have been imported. I don't know that there was a lot of rice. A lot of beans, a lot of pork, definitely a lot of chicken. They were eating ducks. And my guess is Native American hunters were sent down to the lagoon near the San Diego River to hunt for ducks and geese. So those kinds of things. Fish, a lot of fish up there. And again, we have records of Kumeyaay men being sent out to catch fish for the Presidio. So if the Presidio, the question is who was feeding whom? So in this case, it looks like the Kumeyaay were gathering in their traditional way, in their rafts off,
Hmm.
the coast and the kelp beds, sea bass, kelp bass, and bringing them back. So, there's fish tacos going on. There's fish soup, stews. I think they were eating pretty well. Yeah.
It sounds like it. We also talked about games, sports, leisure time. What kind of things did you learn about people's free time and how they spent it?
Well, you could kind of break it down, as you might well imagine, by gender and by occupation. So, based on several documents of the time, gambling was huge amongst the soldiers, and especially a game called Three Card Monte. And if you want to see Three Card Monte, go rent Tombstone with Kurt Russell, and right, that they're playing a game of Monte. You're guessing cards is what you're doing, but they had to go out of the Presidio and off the hill to gamble because the commandant forbid it. But we know they did it, and it's talked about all the time. So they had dice games. We did find some dice. They definitely, we're not sure who, played dominoes. We found some broken dominoes in the deposits. So for the adults, in that sense, it would probably be gambling, dominoes, and such. For the kids, it would be marbles. We found clay marbles. The soldiers also did this thing every now and then where they would bury a chicken in the ground, out in the parade ground, and leave its head above the ground. And then they would come by on their horses with what looks like a polo stick and try to knock the head off the chicken. And so I'm guessing that chicken ended up in a chicken burrito, later that day.
Right.
They did have occasionally a bullfight there, probably of a pretty old, pretty sad bull. And there's one story, which is true. I mean, it's in the records. The bull got loose from where they wanted it to be, and it ran up the hill and then came across the top of the church because the top of the church was built into the hill. The bull ran across the top and fell through the tile and into the church. So then they had to send people into the church with torches to chase the bull out. So a little bit of bullfight going on.
I love it.
Not probably. And then, for the women, they also apparently did play cards, and they also had some games they played having to do with. It's like there's sticks and there's a rock, and you drop the rock and you drop the stick. And the Kumeyaay, I still play that game. I played it down in Baja California a few times. So you had marbles, you had gambling, you had dominoes. You had the occasional bullfight. You had knock the head off the chicken game. Um, and generally that's what we found in the archaeological and archival record. So what, and lot, I won't say lots, but a fair amount of music. We did find some musical parts from a banjo and from a guitarra. So I don't think it was, like some Antonio Banderas movie or something with this beautiful music and fandangos. That's going to be Old Town a little bit later on, but certainly guitar and maybe banjo. We found some whistle and flute parts. So I'm sure there was some music, especially on the days on the Sundays when the priests came up from Mission Valley. You might have had the Ave Maria being performed, and you might have had a guitar playing behind that. So some music on the hill as well. Yeah.
How do you think the development of Old Town or the town at the base of the hill there related to the Presidio, or maybe by that time things had the Presidio was abandoned? What was the relationship there?
It was largely, it was becoming abandoned. The Mexican Revolution and Mexican independence, let's just say 1821. But Mexico was huge, and the independence of it probably didn't get to some regions for a long, long time. But once that independence was accomplished, a couple of things happened, which then lead to Old Town. One is the trade opened up, because prior to that it had been illegal to get French, British, European goods without getting a very special permit from the viceroy, and they were hard to come by because they wanted, this sounds like today almost, tariffs. They wanted local goods to be purchased out of Tlaquepaque and out of Puebla and Guadalajara, all the Mayolicas and all that. But after the revolution, for one thing, the Mexican Navy stopped enforcing things at sea, going up and down looking for pirates, if you will, or traders. And so we see in the archaeological record this influx of French ceramics, of British ceramics, stuff from Belgium. And I think that then is going to lead to the downfall, if you will, of a certain economic system. But because it's not being funded any longer, as early as 1822-23, two families, the Ruiz family and I think the Alvarados, actually retired, the men from the military, and just simply moved down the hill and planted orchards, apples, pears, and built these adobes. They're kind of small, casitas, but these adobes. And gradually then, as one retired, why would you necessarily go back to somewhere you haven't been to for 30 or 40 years? Back to Sinaloa, back to wherever. Plus, some of these soldiers were first generation. They were born here. They were actually born in San Diego and then stayed in the military. So the genesis of it was you almost had to have the collapse of the Presidio for Old Town to ever be, because had it continued, first of all, you were not allowed to have land outside the Presidio. But once you had men of retirement age, invalidos, then they would be given a parcel of land in what's now Old Town. Not exactly a land grant, but just a parcel grant. And that was part of their separation. Like, hey, we haven't paid you well for all these years, but here's a little piece of land. So the Ruiz family, the Alvarado family, several of the other families who still have a lot of descendants in San Diego, started building up what was then called the Pueblo de San Diego. So when Old Town when the Presidio was essentially decommissioned in the 1830s, there was already 6, 8, 10 families living in San Diego, in the Pueblo. And then from there, it grew out. You had certain Yankees like Henry Delano Fitch and a guy named Snook and other, Yankees, usually sailors, but not always. Some fur traders who intermarried with these families. And then you have this little explosion. And then by 1840, by the American takeover of California, the Presidio is essentially no more. People would go up there and have picnics, and look out over the harbor and blah, blah, blah. But by then, it's the Pueblo de San Diego with its own alcalde, its own council, and people forget that 90% of the people on the council for San Diego Pueblo were Mexican. They were Spanish. They were not gringos. They were not, you know, Anglo-Americans. So that's the genesis of Old Town. And then later, of course, San Diego outgrew that, and then they moved to Newtown, and then ultimately downtown. Yeah.
It makes me think of that testimony by Juana Machado, right, whose father was a soldier at the Presidio, and going back to Mexican independence, the thing that stood out in her mind was when they were finally, announced that they were under Mexican rule and that Spain had withdrawn. One of the first things that they had to do was cut their braids, that the soldiers had these long braids that extended down their back, right? And then, of course,
Yeah.
she wound up marrying, well, she was married to a soldier first and then wound up marrying an American merchant. I guess it had been a sailor, right? I think his name was
Wrightington, I think. Yeah.
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 Very interesting. Now, you talk about also crime and punishment at the Presidio. Why did you include a whole chapter on that?
Well, Damien, one of the things I wanted this book to be, and on November 13th at 6 o'clock in the Serra Museum on Presidio Hill is my book launch. So even though the book actually hits the streets October 21st, I've arranged, and it's on Amazon now for pre-order, but I've set up an agreement with the San Diego History Center that we would launch the book at the Serra Museum on the very side of the Presidio. And one of the things I stress to the History Center is, are we going to have some discussants? So I'm going to give a little PowerPoint, and then can we have discussants? And they said, well, yeah. I said, well, I want a Native American. And they can say whatever they want about my book. They can say, well, you glossed over certain things about the Native American, whatever. So as I was writing the book, again, going back to, I wanted a story to be told that maybe hadn't been told before in one cover. I wanted Native Americans in it. I mean, the reason the Presidio was built there was not to defend it from the Russians or the British. It was to defend the mission and the community from the Kumeyaay. I mean, the cannon that they had they would not reach out to the harbor, and so the cannons were pointed towards the Kumeyaay villages, basically. So part of the Kumeyaay experience and non-Kumeyaay at the Presidio it was the Presidium. So if you committed a crime against the crown, and probably the church, but against the crown, then you would be captured, put on trial, and let's say you're found guilty, then the punishment would be done by the commandant or his sergeant, Sergeant Ortega, and it included azotes, whippings, which were prescribed. You could only do 20 a day for 6 days in a row, if it required that many, and on and on and on. So I wanted to get into what was the criminal record. And so you had one Kumeyaay cook at the mission who poisoned the priest. The priest Nazaro poisoned him. Why? Because the priest kept whipping him and abusing him. And he went on trial. He had a pretty good defense attorney who became the commandant of the Santa Barbara Presidio later, by the way. And he said, well, I wasn't trying to kill him. I just wanted him to stop whipping me. So they put him on trial for this, and he got off relatively light, 10 years of imprisonment for attempted murder of a priest, and he was imprisoned there at the Presidio. So part of what I wanted to stress about the Presidio as a presidium, it's also where the prison was for all manner of people. So if you did something illegal in Baja California, that district, you would be imprisoned at San Diego Presidio. So I looked into that. I wanted to know what was going on at the prison. There was a fellow named Naguaso, who was a very important Kumeyaay leader. And after the insurrection of 1775, he was imprisoned, would not talk to Father Serra. When Father Serra came to talk to him and try to get him to convert, he wouldn't talk to Rivera Moncada, the commandant. And one night he hanged himself in his prison cell. So that's part of what I wanted the reader to get, was this was not a happy place. This was not just a fort. Some really bad things happened there. We excavated at least one Kumeyaay out of 4 that we know of who still had the .48 caliber cannon, musket ball in his chest. I did not put that photograph in the book out of deference to Native American community. There are no Native American burials photographed in the books. And we found him with his musket ball. And so there were executions there. We found a wall facing south, and outside that wall, that adobe wall, in the ground were 5 or 6 musket balls, and they were flat-ish. I think that's the wall they were lined up against and shot, frankly. So I was looking at execution, I was looking at hangings, I was looking at whippings, and there were also, if you were a Spanish or later Mexican soldier and you committed a crime, you were thrown in that same prison and often given hard labor. If you were from a mission up in Los Angeles, Orange County area, and you were a soldier up there, or anybody, a merchant, and you committed a crime, you would be sent to San Diego and imprisoned. So I wanted the prison aspect of it to come out as well, because when I give tours, I can stand people right where the prison was and say, here's where this 4 by 5 foot cell was. You could hardly lay down. You'd have to be diagonal, right? If you were 5'4", 5'6". So that's part of the crime and punishment part of it. And if you noticed in the book, Damien, part of what I was trying to do too was separate the mission from the Presidio. They're two very, very, that's my next book, I hope, is on the mission, because I dug there in 1989 and we found amazing, truly amazing things. So I wanted to say to my Kumeyaay colleagues, the chairwoman from Hamul, Erica Pinto, is going to be one of the discussants. So when I sent her the book, she said, well, you didn't talk about this and this and this. I said, that's the mission. What you're talking about did not go on here. This fort's not trying to missionize people. It's trying to hire them to build adobe walls. They're intermarrying with them. No one's intermarrying at the mission, right? So that was the crime and punishment aspect of it. And it was a result of an article I had in the bulletin about crime and punishment in San Diego County.
I remember that.
Get a bigger audience, a larger audience. Yeah.
Can we go back a little bit to that? That was very interesting about the cook who was accused of poisoning the padre. But you said he had a defense attorney who later became the commandant of the Presidio. What were the rights, say, that someone accused, including a native person, accused of a crime had? It sounds like they had a defense attorney, for example.
They did. And, if we're talking, let's just do round numbers, 1770 to 1840. So we're talking over 70 years. And in most countries, the legal system over about a 70-year period changes a little bit, certainly as ours has. So early on, realizing these people, the commandants, the priest, are the end result of the Enlightenment. So this is not the Inquisition. This is the Enlightened period. One can argue how enlightened that was if you were Native American, right? But nonetheless. And so the law of the land for the New World said that people who were accused of crimes had to get a trial. You were not allowed to do vigilante justice. They were trying to reduce that. And at your trial, you were supposed to have somebody who represented you. And typically, the only people in Alta California who could represent you even halfway fairly, because there were no attorneys, would have been an officer who allegedly knew the law of the crown and who knew the rights of Native American people under that, going back to several reformers, including Las Casas back in the day. And so usually it was a roughly young person, but an officer. I should remember his name, and it may come to me it's in the book. And he was, I think, a captain at the time, was pretty well, you had to be literate. You had to be able to write and read. That's the stipulation. And then you were actually allowed almost a period of discovery. It's kind of interesting when you really dig into it. And you were supposed to give whoever, the Spaniard, the Californio, the Mexicano, the Native American, the best defense based on the law of the land. And so was there a reason to murder somebody? Sometimes there was. Self-defense, they'd raped your wife, whatever. Small things, stealing a loaf of bread. Okay, you're not going to get capital for that. You're not going to be killed for a loaf of bread. So part of it was reading the law of the land and what category does this fall into. And in his case, the Native American, his defense said, well, he said he didn't try to kill him and he didn't die. So we don't, it's an attempted murder, maybe, but it's more an assault on a priest. And that's why it never came up that he would get life imprisonment or exile, which was really common for Native Americans, to send them away from their family and send them away from their land, usually down to Loreto. And so he got him off with 10 years. And ironically enough, while he was in jail the next year, the priest died. It took a year, apparently. And there's all kinds of speculation. The Kumeyaay community says, well, yeah, the people kept poisoning him and then he died. Other people go, no, see, it took a year. And there was very small talk at the time of opening the case back up and putting him back on trial for murder because the fellow died, the priest died, and not just the 10 years. And people of some better knowledge, including, I think, Sarah, said no. He was found guilty of this, case done. You cannot open the case back up just because we don't know why he died. Right? We don't know why he died. It might not have been this guy's fault. So yeah, there was a whole system going on. I would like to see people do more with that because, you and I know that the Spanish history in both of California's and Mexican history has been so all stuck together like it was one. Like
Right.
all the missions operated exactly alike. All the commandants were, all the presidios, all the tribes responded, and you got to do 21 different stories over time. But there was this attempt to Spaniards perceive themselves, especially by this time, to be the most enlightened country in the world, and they wanted that to extend to the New World. They didn't want it to get degraded just because you're on La Frontera. You still need to do things right. Not to say abuses didn't happen, right?
Correct.
But in theory, yeah.
Well, something you mentioned, I think at the beginning, you don't go looking for conquistadors with metal helmets, right? And when you're talking about the Presidio, or especially the time period when the Spanish were in California, for example, that
Right.
there's this long continuum of an evolution of people and culture. So, and maybe getting close to wrapping up, who would you say the ideal readership is for this book, or who did you have in mind, or who do you have in mind now?
For the time, well, history, some people say history is a double-edged sword, right? I look at it more as a cube. And if you look at the front of the cube, it's this. If you turn it over here, it's this. If you flip it this way, it's that. So I call it my cubist view, not Cuban, view of history. If I want the one man that I find to be admirable, given the time period, given his education, and all manner of context, if you will, is probably Fernando Rivera y Moncada. He was very intelligent. He came up from Mexico. He'd been successful down there as a young captain, came up here and was in charge of the Presidio. He, to me, for the time period, was a very balanced military officer in treatment of both the Native Americans and his own soldiers. Some of the commandants were not. And I think he tried within the constricts of the time to be as fair as he could be to people he encountered. I think he kept the Presidio running at a time when it was just kind of really zooming up. So he was there until 1778. He was there, and by the way, he ends up being killed on the Colorado River by the Quetzon Indians.
That's right.
Because he came across one time too many and didn't bring enough gifts, frankly, and they killed him. The Quetzon killed him. They kept warning him, you need more tribute. You're coming across our land. He was there during the sacking of Mission San Diego. So if I want to look at it from a Kumeyaay viewpoint, he did authorize whippings and torturing of some of the cabecillas, some of the leaders of the revolt in 1775. But that was his role as a military officer. And so a native can argue, well, that wasn't fair to our people and all that. But if you look at it through the scope of his job, and he was trying to get information to go out and punish the people who'd killed Father Jaime and capture them and punish them. So when I look at him overall, I find him to be, if not admirable for the time and the place, a good example of a fair, intelligent military officer versus, we can go back and forth about Father Luis Jaime. We can go back and forth about Nazaro, who did in fact whip that poor Indian, Native American, or Junipero Serra himself. These guys are flashpoints, and it depends on how you want to look at it. But I would say he was the guy I would look to a lot. And if I were ever going to write a biography of somebody and try to explain what was going on, it would be him. If it were Native American, it would be the young woman from Chula Vista, Sinew Scene, who, with her parents got baptized when she was very young and then married a soldier, had children, married another soldier. And by the way, she's buried in Santa Barbara. She ultimately, with her second husband and three of her children, moved up to Santa Barbara. And in her death record, I'm sure you've seen some of the death records, but in the death record, it says she was beloved, blah, 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 and that she was a mujer del mundo. She was a woman of the world. That's unusual. They don't usually go on about, especially Native Americans. So she was clearly a very important person. Yeah. So the opposing sides at some level, right?
Right. Who do you hope picks up this book and reads it? Everybody. But who
your relatives.
Yeah, definitely.
I've got 10 talks scheduled as soon as the book comes out. And a lot of them are to historical societies. I do adult education. I would hope, tourists aside, I would certainly like the tourists to read it and leave with a better understanding of San Diego history as seen at the Presidio. But locally, I would like the local average person who knows almost nothing about the Presidio, not much, there was the mission period, there was this, to understand who was here before them and that the roots of those Spanish soldiers and their native wives are still out here as descendants. There's a group here in San Diego called the Descendants Association, the Carrillos, the Alvarados, the Machados, all these. I want them to read it, and I want them to see their family's name in there, and they can decide if they want to be proud or not, but that their family. So mainly local people. I want local people to, at some point, go, I didn't know that. I didn't know there were Indian wives up there. I didn't know they shot people, the good and the bad, the good and the bad. And that, I guess the overarching part of it is that is where we started in California. That's where the first mission was. It's where the first Presidio was. It's where the first Spanish colony was that became what we are today, Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Barbara. Yeah.
And I think people are interested, at least I am, but I think people in general are interested in seeing history, local history, with the light and the shadows, the warts, because it makes it more connected to our own day-to-day life, which is full of that as well, right? Rather than, we certainly don't live in an idealized time, but the more you know about the past, there never really was one. And so I think people are open to that, understanding of, okay, these are the good things, the bad things, the violence, the family relationships, the food. I think that's one of the cool things about this book, and it's going to make it of interest to curious people.
Well, that is definitely the intent, and that's why I did not write it in an overly academic way. I didn't want people to be turned off by the kind of language that you and I do when we write an academic article for a juried journal. I want it to be something they can read a couple chapters, lay down, pick up, read a couple chapters, and every couple chapters go, I did not know that, which means they have learned something, and as educators, that's our ultimate goal, right? Is to educate people, open up their mind, but also, like you say, find these ties back to the past, especially in a state or certain communities that have overglorified the American period. I want people to know about that other period too. That was very, very important, and that's still with us in some ways. Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the valuable things about this book also is that it's accessible, but it's written by somebody who has done the hard academic work that shores up everything that's in there. So people who are curious, more curious, going in more depth, can also look up the things you've written that are academic, that are archaeological, anthropological, especially I would think, related to the Kumeyaay presence, the Spanish presence in California. So there's a lot there to dig into.
Yeah, and that's why I put a bibliography. The publisher nor I really wanted a lot of footnotes, as you and I might traditionally do, or as scholars do, because it breaks up the flow in a non-academic article book. And so, but I did want, just as you said, I want some readers to be able to go, well, where can I find out a little bit more about that? And go read an article by Sandoz or by Robert Jackson or whoever, right? And some of the stuff I've written and follow up on it. I'd love that. If I gave a talk somewhere and they say, hey, I read Sandoz's article on that, or Haeckel's article, I'd be really happy.
Exactly. Well, I hope, we'll stay in touch. Let me know if there are any talks that you're giving that are going to be posted online for people to see, that can learn more. And I'll try and get those out to the readers and the watchers of this channel. And is there any last thing you want to say about the book, or that we didn't quite cover?
No, I think you've done a great job. I would tell people to look for maybe a year from now, a book on the mission of San Diego, which is going to be a much darker story, frankly, and that the whole mission Presidio Spanish colonial situation and history is just it's more than just peeling back an onion. It's an onion wrapped in a ball of twine, and it just keeps going on, and you can take so many different avenues. So no, I appreciate you having me on and taking the time to talk to me. And I will send you, I've got a list that I just sent my publisher of where I'm giving talks and which ones I think will be Zoomed or recorded for the future and all that, and people could tune into them. Yeah.
Well, that'd be great. I'm looking forward to reading that book as well. So, Richard Carrico, thank you so much, and look forward to hearing more about the book and the different things you'll be doing in relation to it. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks again, Damien.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out. Today, I'm happy to present the second half of